Ukrainian forces have been fighting back against Russian assaults on the outskirts of Kyiv. Authorities have urged citizens to help defend the capital. Guns are being handed out to ordinary citizens, and people are being urged to make petrol bombs and resist. Russian troops attacked an army base located on a main Kyiv avenue, but the assault was repelled, the Ukrainian military said. President Volodymyr Zelensky has denied Russian claims that he had fled the capital, saying in a social media video, quote, "We will not lay down our weapons. We will defend our state." He has also refused an American offer to leave Kyiv. And DW correspondent Nick Connolly joins us now on the line. He was in Kyiv, but he's now moved to another location. Nick, tell us, how was the night? What's it been like where you are, and what are you hearing from Ukraine's capital?
So I'm in a city called Vinnytsia, about 200 kilometers southwest of Kyiv. It took us about 10 hours to get here yesterday because of all those people trying to get out. We've been in the bomb shelter under the building we're in now twice last night, sirens going up twice. We haven't heard any bombings close to where we are, but definitely a huge anxiety, especially given that there are Ukrainian military installations in this region. So this could obviously be a potential target. As for Kyiv, well, extraordinary images on social media of Russian units pretty close to the center of Kyiv. I mean, even yesterday when we were leaving Kyiv, we passed an aerodrome that's, well, past the road leading to an aerodrome on the northwestern fringes of Kyiv, where Russian helicopters had tried to bring in commandos and, extraordinarily long and protracted fighting going on there. It seems, based on the reports we have now, that the Ukrainian forces have regained control of that aerodrome. Reports of kind of false flag operations elsewhere, seemingly Russian soldiers wearing Ukrainian uniforms trying to set up the ground for kind of more involvement of their forces coming in all across basically residential district of Kyiv. Ukrainian authorities saying that those people have been detained, and there certainly are images on social media of people detained and on the ground with their arms and legs tied. People the Ukrainians say are Russian agents trying to undermine that resistance. I think definitely this has brought lots of Ukrainians together. I think people weren't quite maybe expecting that Volodymyr Zelensky would be quite as forthright about this, that he would stay in Kyiv despite the threats. I think this has actually done a lot of good for morale here in Ukraine. People in the bomb shelter yesterday, on average, worried still, obviously, and very conscious of their vulnerability, but also taking heart from the fact that this is taking a lot longer than seemingly the Russians expected it would.
OK, so let's talk about the fact that Zelensky is refusing to leave. As you say, Russian troops are advancing towards Kyiv fast. He's saying he's staying put. Why? What message is he trying to send?
This is about the optics. This is about showing that they are not going to run. They're not going to roll over. I think you have to remember Ukraine. There's a deep trauma of those events of 2014, how easy it was for Russia to take Crimea, to stoke those separatist conflicts in the east. That was a time where Ukraine basically didn't have a functional government after the Maidan Revolution. The previous government had gone and the new one hadn't really taken over yet. So I think there's definitely a very strong desire to just not give ground. And I think they also believe that they can win this, maybe not in outright war, but in terms of dragging this on long enough, making the costs high enough for Russia until Russia has to come to some kind of arrangement. We heard Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday saying that at some point Russia would have to come to them and talk about ending this. I think we've seen unparalleled diplomatic pressure on Russia in the recent hours, even in culture, sports tournaments being cancelled in Russia, Russian teams not being invited to things, even pop stars, cultural figures around the world expressing their feelings about this, their outrage. So I think there is definitely a feeling that if Ukraine can stay firm, can prevent some kind of panic among the population, prevent a kind of collapse in terms of military logistics, then this is actually not going Russia's way. I think they believe that now finally the rest of the world is seeing Russia's intent towards them the same way they've been seeing it for the past 8 years since Russia annexed Crimea and stoked those conflicts in Donbass.
All right. DW correspondent Nick Connolly, thanks so much for your reporting, and do stay safe. Now, back in Kyiv, many residents have taken shelter where they can. The government has handed out thousands of guns to ordinary citizens and is urging them to build petrol bombs to resist.
The northern outskirts of Kyiv, the front lines in the Russian assault on Ukraine's capital. Volunteers have taken up arms to defend the city. But without heavy defensive weapons, there's only so much they can do.
It's not enough in order to stop helicopters. It's not enough in order to stop tanks. I need something to stop this.
Outnumbered and outgunned, but refusing to quit. Ukraine's cabinet sent a message of encouragement on social media. The president is here. We're all here. Our military, citizens of society are here. We're all here defending our independence, our country, and it will remain so. Glory to our men and women defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Many of those who aren't picking up arms are taking refuge in the city's metro. It's safer underground. I even woke up today with the news that there was shelling in the central area. They can even target our house, so it's safer underground. Also, the shelter in our building is not as deep underground as the metro station. Those who want to get out of the city find roads choked with vehicles, some out of gas, or abandoned by those who continued on foot. The situation at Kyiv's central train station doesn't look much better.
We've been trying all day since this morning, but as you can see here, it's unrealistic. There's lots of us, a dog, we can't fit. We're going back. You have to push through, but how are we supposed to do that with a child? The dog is scared, it's dangerous, we won't go. And honestly, I don't have the energy to wait for the next one. I just don't.
But even getting out of Kyiv is no guarantee of safety. Many men of fighting age who make it to the border are being turned back by the Ukrainian military and told to report to the front lines.
Now, Russia has vetoed a draft UN Security Council resolution that condemned its invasion of Ukraine and called on Moscow to withdraw troops immediately. 11 countries on the 15-member council voted in favour, while India, China and the United Arab Emirates abstained.
11 votes in favour, 1 against, 3 abstentions.
It was the result everyone was expecting, Russia blocking criticism of its invasion.
I'm not surprised that Russia voted against. Russia is keen on continuing its Nazi-style course of action.
The US also slammed Russia for its veto.
You can veto this resolution, but you cannot veto our voices. You cannot veto the truth. You cannot veto our principles. You cannot veto the Ukrainian people.
But Moscow's representative said the resolution was one-sided.
What was left out was the way that the Ukrainian authorities, with the encouragement of their Western patrons, consistently and cynically shirked their responsibility to implement the Minsk agreements, the linchpin which was a direct dialogue with the residents of the country's east.
While the resolution may have been doomed from the start, for Ukraine and its allies there was a small glimmer of hope. They say China's abstention demonstrated just how isolated Russia is on the international stage.
And I'm joined now by DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, to break this down for us, Richard. Thanks for being here. Now, not a surprise that Russia vetoed this draft UN Security Council resolution, but no country voted with it. So does this suggest that Putin is losing support?
Well, I think the Russians are looking quite isolated after this vote. As we heard there, it's seen as quite significant that China abstained rather than supporting it. Perhaps we can look at the countries that abstained. It's interesting to look at those. We can talk about those in just a moment. But not a single country out of the 15 members supporting it. And if you look at some of the individual countries, for example, Brazil, where the President Bolsonaro is quite on the same wavelength as Vladimir Putin, as a kind of new model, sort of authoritarian-style leader, and was just recently expressing his solidarity with Vladimir Putin, and just yesterday slapping down his deputy for having expressed support for Ukraine and saying, that's not your business, that's my business as president. Despite all of that, Brazil voting in support of this resolution rather than, for example, abstaining, which some said was a possibility. So, yeah, Russia looking quite isolated. And what's going to be interesting as the next step at the United Nations is that this now will be most likely taken up by the General Assembly, so with all of the member states of the United Nations. There are no vetoes there. So that's going to be kind of a roll call of the entire world of where it stands, where every single country around the world stands on this. So we'll be watching for how that vote goes.
So let's talk more about these three abstentions, as you were saying, China, India and the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah. So, I mean, China, first of all, we've touched on that. China has been getting closer and closer to Russia, the two countries kind of forming a closer relationship and trying to push back against what they see as American attempts to shore up its hegemony around the world. And China often votes with Russia on the UN Security Council. The fact that it abstained is being seen in the West, held up in the West as evidence that China really has concerns about what's happening. And if you watch China's messaging in recent days, it has been kind of a little bit divided. On the one hand, sort of signifying support for Russia over its demands for security, guarantees from the West, opposition to the expansion of NATO. But on the other hand, being very clear that it does see Ukraine as a sovereign state whose territorial integrity needs to be supported. So that shows that China, is trying to straddle those positions. There'll be some disappointment, I think, in the West that India abstained rather than voting in favour of this. But it will be a huge step for India to vote against Russia. India has a long-standing relationship with Russia. It gets most of its defence equipment from Russia. So that might have been an unrealistic expectation. India doing everything it can not to get sort of sucked into one side or the other of this conflict. Although Narendra Modi, in a call, the Prime Minister of India with Vladimir Putin the other day, did say that he wanted an immediate cessation of hostilities. And then the United Arab Emirates, well, it's been growing closer to Russia in recent years. But there will be a lot of disappointment in the West, particularly in the United States, that a country that it saw as an important partner in the Middle East was abstaining on this. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of fallout that abstention by the UAE has.
After all of this diplomacy, really incredible efforts, where do we stand now?
Yeah, so we've seen this playing out at the United Nations, so we'll see how that General Assembly vote turns out, but we're beginning to get a sense of the international community's attitude to what's happening here. Russia looking quite isolated. The West is looking pretty united. There's some debate about whether the West went far enough in its sanctions, but very much the sanctions moves across Western countries are being seen as pretty much in lockstep. NATO is making moves to strengthen the defence of its allies in the region around Ukraine. So really the focus now is how fast do things go militarily in Ukraine? There's little doubt that Russia is in a strong position to defeat the Ukrainian military. How quickly does it go? What happens next? There's been some talk of talks between Ukraine and Russia. Do they come to anything? Do they get going? So really the focus is back on the ground in Ukraine. What happens next there?
Can I just briefly ask you about this idea of talks between Russia and Ukraine? I mean, this seems slightly extraordinary, but do you think there could be a chance that something like this might happen?
I think it's too early to say. But the indications from the Russians yesterday that they would be prepared to hold talks with the Ukrainians, but on significant conditions, and that those talks would be about Ukraine totally giving in, and also, talk of a declaration of neutrality. We don't know. It's too early to say, I think, in the dynamic of this war situation, whether those talks do take place. But that was a new development yesterday that, of course, we'll be watching closely.
Mm-hmm. All right. Richard Walker, DW's Chief International Editor. Thank you for that. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeated a call to Ukrainian soldiers to surrender, making baseless accusations against the Ukrainian government.
Once again, I appeal to the servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. Do not allow neo-Nazis to use your children, your wives and elderly as human shields. Take power into your own hands. It seems that it would be easier for us to come to an agreement than with this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who settled in Kyiv and took the entire Ukrainian people hostage.
All right, well, let's get the view from Russia. For that, I'm joined by journalist Natalia Smolentseva in Moscow. Thank you for joining us. We just heard President Putin there speaking directly to the Ukrainian people. Can you tell us a little more about what he was saying there?
Yes, exactly. So this is an address from yesterday, and Putin was talking not to the Zelensky, not to the authorities in Kyiv, but directly to Ukrainian people and to Ukrainian soldiers. And these are the people that Kremlin, the Russia, they claim that they are going to protect in Ukraine. And this is the goal of their operation, military operation, as it's called here, to protect the people. And that's why he's saying that he's addressing directly to them, because he doesn't see the possibility of addressing the authorities in Kyiv anymore. This questions the whole willingness of Russia to actually go into the talks that you've been just discussing before. And after this address, it's unclear if they're going to continue with the offer of the talks in Minsk or somewhere else. And basically what he was saying is that he was urging the soldiers to overthrow the regime in Kyiv, their authorities in Kyiv, and to directly take the situation in their hands and to talk to the Russian Federation on their own terms. That's what he was saying. He was using the word of Nazi regime in Ukraine that he has already used before. He is also using the word drug addicts, referring to people in power in Ukraine, and all these very, very heavy, very horrible words that we've been hearing in the Russian media portraying Ukraine recently.
I mean, these are really quite some terms to be using. How are they going over? I mean, are these being well received by the Russian people, terms like this?
Well, for the past days, Russian public is, I can say, shocked and very divided on this issue. A lot of people don't really know what to think about this invasion, because we have seen some protests, we have seen some people online voicing their opinion, not supporting this. But I have to say that before, it hasn't started just now. There have been a lot of build-up in the Russian media to this operation, and for the past month and even year, there's been this narrative of Russia being constantly attacked from the West, from NATO, and this operation, this war, this invasion is seen in Russia as defensive measure against the aggression from the West.
Now, Western powers on Friday announced targeted sanctions against President Putin and his foreign minister Lavrov. How is that going down in Moscow?
Well, Russia is used to sanctions, and the news of sanctions obviously was expected here, but I think the scale of the sanctions is far bigger than everybody could expect. And I think this personal sanctions against Putin and Lavrov is something new we haven't seen before. But I think what people here are concerned with are sanctions against the Russian economy, against the Russian banks, against the Russian airlines, against everything that can actually hinder the Russian economy and have an impact on their lives of people. We've seen people rushing to the banks to get out as much cash as they could, with this unprecedented queues in Moscow and other cities. We've seen people trying to buy some electronic devices because they're expecting prices to go up, since one of the sanctions announced by the US is the lack of supply of the basically gadgets and electronics and everything like this. So people are just shocked and panic and don't know what to do, so they're trying to react to this as fast as they can.
Now, we have seen protests in several Russian cities, and from what you're describing, people are being affected by what's happening. So how big is this opposition to this war in Russia, and really how much of a problem is this for President Putin?
Well, there have been protests and there have been people voicing their opinion online, but I don't think this will have any effect on the actions of the Russian authorities, of the Kremlin. It's unlikely that this opposition, this protest will, as I said, have an effect, because we've seen major protests in Russia before in the past couple of years, especially after Russian opposition Alexei Navalny was poisoned and came back here and was jailed. There have been a lot of people on the streets, far more than we've seen in the recent days, and it hasn't changed anything. I have to say, it only made the situation for those brave Russians who go out on the streets even worse. We've seen some protests on Thursday, especially. Yesterday, there have been small numbers of people on the streets, and we know about around 500 people detained yesterday. And we've seen some people signing petitions and signing up open letters to Vladimir Putin, but there is really not much of a hope that this will have an effect.
All right. Journalist Natalia Smolentseva in Moscow speaking to us there. Thank you so much. Now, many of those caught up in the invasion have fled to neighbouring countries. The UN is saying that more than 50,000 Ukrainian refugees have left since Thursday. And we can see where most are headed, to countries neighbouring Ukraine. These include EU members Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania, as well as non-EU member Moldova. As fighting worsens, these countries are now bracing for more refugees in the coming days.
The train station in the Polish city of Przemysl, 10 kilometers from Ukraine. For many Ukrainian refugees, it's their first stop after crossing the border. These 4 children are having their first hot meal in 30 hours after traveling 450 kilometers through Ukraine. Their fathers weren't able to join them. They stayed behind to fight. The children are now waiting for their mothers to arrive.
There were masses of people on the way. We took a bus towards the border and then walked. Then we stood in a long queue. Suddenly we saw our cousins, and we've been together since then. We waited a long time for the transport from the border. And now we're finally here.
The way was hard and long. Because of traffic jams, they had to get off the bus and walk the last 15 kilometers to the border. Near Lviv, they heard explosions.
It was terrible. There were rockets flying. We came here without passports. We only have our birth certificates. We were let into Poland as refugees.
The Polish authorities have decided to let all Ukrainians into the country, even those who have no passports, which are normally required to enter the EU. At the train station, as well as in several reception centres, they are supported by volunteers and the military. The refugees are relieved to have escaped the war, but they're also worried about what they have left behind, the events in their country. Those who are not picked up here by friends or relatives are taken in by private individuals. The willingness to help is great. Within a day of the Russian invasion, 30,000 refugees arrived in Poland from Ukraine. The government in Warsaw expects that up to 1 million people could flee to the country, and it promises that they will all be taken in.
Now, the world of sports is also reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Formula One has cancelled the Russian Grand Prix, scheduled for the end of September. The Russian Grand Prix has been a fixture of the racing calendar for a number of years, since Formula One made a deal with the country back in 2011. Formula One driver Sebastian Vettel had declared his intention to boycott the event, even if it went ahead, saying it would be completely wrong to stage a race in Russia under the current circumstances. And tennis player Andrei Rublev has joined a number of Russian public figures speaking out against Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine. After a match in Dubai on Friday, Rublev wrote the words, "No war, please," on a broadcaster's camera. Since Thursday, a number of prominent television personalities, musicians and athletes within Russia have also issued public statements on social media condemning the invasion. And Bundesliga sides Hoffenheim and Stuttgart came together to make a statement condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine ahead of their match on Friday evening. Before the game kicked off, both teams lined up together behind a banner bearing an anti-war slogan in Ukrainian colours. A moment's silence was then held in honour of the casualties of the invasion.